So, Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fernando, and good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I have a few slides, and I believe they will be on the screen. Yes, thank you. I will keep it brief because I believe that many of the things you will be aware of, and I'm more than happy to discuss any questions you may have in this context. But I think this would be the most fruitful option for us to use. So if you could go through the next two slides relatively quickly. ACEA is representing the vehicle manufacturers. In my case, I'm Director Commercial Vehicles, which means I'm responsible for the heavy duty manufacturers, everything above 3.5 tons. Next one, please. Um, there's no need to mention the role of the industry, of course, so we can skip this one. Next one, please. And this one is something that is just, you've seen this, you might have seen this before because it is among our key messages here that decarbonizing road transport is something that the vehicle manufacturers are clearly very much committed to as quickly as possible. At the same time, it is more than just looking at the vehicles. There was a time, if you look, for example, at the pollutant emissions side of things. So looking back to the 90s, for example, when you talk about the catalysts and Euro 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 regulations, pollutant emissions, all the burden, if you want, was put on the OEMs back then, and to an extent, rightly so, because this is where the problem could be solved, the problem of tailpipe pollutant emissions. Decarbonizing road transport is different. It requires vehicles, which is vehicle manufacturers' responsibilities. It requires alternative energy carriers, to put it broadly. That means decarbonizing electricity to the extent that it will be used in road transport, decarbonizing hydrogen, but also decarbonizing whatever fuels are being used. And it requires infrastructure. None of this is necessarily under the control of vehicle manufacturers. And the third point that is necessary for the decarbonization of road transport is cost parity. All of you know perfectly well that no one is driving around a truck just for fun. And that might be a different for passenger cars. So unless it doesn't make sense from a commercial perspective, unless the vehicles can do their job, and it doesn't not only depend on vehicle manufacturers that that's the case, and they can do so more profitably, at least as profitably as conventional vehicles, this transition to carbon neutral solutions will not happen. But if it is possible, if all of these key ingredients are in place, then things will happen very quickly, because everybody who doesn't switch back then will essentially lose out on opportunities. Next one, please. The industry's perspective on all of this is very naturally and as a matter of fact more long term than what your individual company's perspectives might be here, because we of course have to think, and this is where we're on the same page, of course, have to think medium long term how to do the things right. And medium long term, and here in our perspective that means 2040 is the time frame. We need to be fully fossil free by then. It also means that we, from our perspective today, that road transport will be powered, the backbone of road transport will be powered by zero emission technologies. That is battery electric vehicles and that is hydrogen powered vehicles, be it carbon neutral hydrogen powering fuel cell electric vehicles, or an interesting option being developed at the moment, hydrogen combustion engines. So carbon neutrality in road transport doesn't mean that the internal combustion engine is going to be phased out. But just to be very clear, the backbone, as we keep saying, of road transport will have to be zero emission technologies very quickly. And that is first and foremost battery electric and hydrogen powered vehicles. The extent to which we are able to phase out or make this transition And again, it's not a transition on the vehicle side only. It's a system transformation, if you want. The extent to which the pace at which this will be possible depends on factors that are largely outside our control. Infrastructure availability, for example, and cost parity, as I mentioned before. So the short and medium term perspective of vehicle manufacturers is very much focused on making the business case for the zero emission technologies, while acknowledging, and this is what we keep reminding policymakers in Brussels of, is that road transport, commercial road transport, is a rational business. So it has a myriad of use cases. So there's no one size fits all, but that doesn't contradict the statement that the backbone of road transport will be zero emission technologies. Next one, please. We have an overview, and we're in the process of updating this, of the vehicles that are available already. And you will see this. You might have seen this before. It's already from summer last year. We're in the process of updating this at the moment. If you go to the next slide, you will see that there's just a range of screenshots I took from the OEM's websites that shall give you an indication of that things are really beginning to move at a small start here, with the on small levels, of course, in the start. But one manufacturer, you will see this in the graphs here, has just reported earlier this week that over the last 12 months they had deliveries across all their brands of more than 4,000 zero emission vehicles, and all of the manufacturers have the offering focused on what I just described. Order intake, of course, if you look at the total volume of the market, then order intake is starting slow, but that's how it has always been. This is just to give you the confidence that vehicle manufacturers are very much focused on bringing these vehicles to the market, and it is beginning to happen now. On the next slide, you will see, and this is a bit of background. Of course, we are driven. Commercial road transport is as I said, is a B2B market, so it is driven by demand. At the same time, we're all being shaped, if you want, by the regulatory environment under which we're operating. And the current regulatory environment has targets for us, CO2 reduction targets for the new vehicle fleet in place of minus 15% by 2025 and minus 30% by 2030. Now, the European Commission, and this is compared to a 2019 baseline, the European Commission recently proposed earlier this year a revision of these targets, and they proposed an increase of the 2030 target to minus 45%. They proposed a 35 target to 65%, and then that's a mistake here, a 2040 target to minus 90%. This is very much driving us as vehicle manufacturers with respect to the vehicle offering. And on the right-hand side here, I would like to emphasize that the ones that you see in the CO2 emission shares by different groups, the light parts of the pie chart here are the CO2 emissions of the groups that are already regulated today. And the small one, the 25%, are vehicle segments that are now being proposed to be included in the regulation. So that gives you an indication that roughly 3/4 of the emissions are in the regulation today. And with the proposed review, there's an increase of this is an addition of another 25%. So we're basically regulating almost all of the emissions of heavy-duty road transport under what is currently being discussed. Now, what does it mean for vehicle manufacturers? And I would like to, on the next slide, also a slight background here. I think it was Rosie, you said in the beginning that, of course, the lighter vehicle segments are the lighter vehicles are the ones that may be easier to electrify. Our perspective on this, and that is luckily reflected in the regulation framework, is we need to cut the emissions where it matters most. And it matters most, and this is what you see here, in what is called the 5LH subgroup. That's the 4x2 tractor units. Heavy duty long haul is where the problem is. And that's why the vehicle manufacturers are very much focusing on providing a solution for this segment, and then step by step rolling it out to the different to the other different vehicle segments. So you may complain. I didn't understand it as a complaint, but you may complain that it is that the vehicle offering in certain segments may be limited. I would argue it is not any longer, but the very reason for this is that what we need to focus on where we have to cut the emissions, and that is unfortunately the most demanding segment, heavy duty long haul, 4x2 tractor trailer units. Next slide, please. And this translates this regulation framework, 45% reduction target. We made the calculation, means that we will need to have about 400,000 zero emission vehicles in operation by the end of this decade. 400,000 out of a total share of the fleet of about 2.5 million, 2.5 million of the heavy trucks, and the total fleet is about 6 million or so, 6 to 7 million. So out of this, by the end of the decade, we will have to have at least 400,000 zero emission vehicles in operation, and close to 100,000 to be registered annually from 2030 as zero emission vehicles. That's more than a third. So it gives you an indication of how quickly things will have to move. And all of them will require, to the extent, let's assume the majority of those will be battery electric vehicles, also in heavy duty long haul, then all of them will require charging infrastructure at the depot. But in addition to that, to this, they will also obviously need en route infrastructure, so charging infrastructure that is available during the operation, publicly accessible. And for that, our analysis is that we need about 50,000 charging stations publicly available throughout Europe by the end of this decade, out of which about 35,000 or so will have to be capable of megawatt charging. Now, this obviously poses a huge challenge for the locations, actually, the grid connections and all of this related. But this is the challenge that we're faced with on the vehicle manufacturer side, and this is what we're trying to make an offer for, and this is what is coming in our view. Next slide, and then I can keep it short. So I won't bother you with this, but just to give you an indication that, of course, these are not estimates as rule of thumbs estimates, but we are basing our understanding and our estimates on how much charging infrastructure, for example, we will need on the operational patterns of these vehicles. And our assumption is that they will not fundamentally differ from how they're being operated today. The driving and resting time regulation, of course, being one of the driving parameters here. And on the next slide, you will see that most of the charging will have to happen and will naturally happen at the depots, different for different vehicle segments, but nevertheless, there's a huge demand for publicly accessible infrastructure on top of this. So there is no contradiction when we're saying that 80–90% of the charging will have to happen in depots, to saying that we will need about 50,000 or so at the very least of publicly accessible chargers. And this is obviously a huge challenge, and I didn't talk about hydrogen yet. So this will come on top of this. Next slide, please. AFIR, which is the other regulation that is crucial in this context, the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure Regulation, does provide a good starting point. We believe that it covers about 50%, perhaps 2/3, depending on implementation, of what is actually needed. But there will be a gap from what the AFIR is member states requiring to provide, and what the actual demand will be for charging and refueling infrastructure if the vehicle rollout materializes, the market adoption of the vehicle rollout materializes as we anticipate, and as we have to anticipate, because we're faced with the regulation framework. Next slide, and I believe this will be my last one. So when it comes to conclusions, the ZEV offering, zero emission vehicles, is the focus of vehicle manufacturers, and the offering grows quickly at the moment. It does not mean that the internal combustion engine vehicles will disappear anytime soon. If we're to meet our CO2 reduction targets, then it also means that decarbonizing all energy carriers will be crucial. Our focus on, for example, battery electric vehicles does not negate or contradict the need to decarbonize fuels. But the market adoption of the vehicles largely depends on additional factors which are outside our control. I mentioned two of them, infrastructure, publicly available and private infrastructure, and cost parity, mainly the total cost of ownerships. And here is where other regulations, Fernando, we spoke about this earlier, come into play, the Weights and Dimensions Directive, for example. What we're quite unhappy with still is the regulatory framework must be a lot more coherent and a lot more effective on all levels, European, national, regional, and local level. And by that, I mean decisions have already been taken now with the Green Deal, but also with the CO2 regulation for vehicle manufacturers that it is in place already today. Now, questioning whether these regulations should actually be adjusted or could perhaps be implemented differently on national level, or that the AFIR, for example, should not be interpreted as strict as it was proposed. This is not supporting a coherent regulatory framework, and would actually delay the transition to zero emission vehicles. Thank you very much. And with that, I think I'll leave it. Happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for the presentation. Straightforward, plenty of insights and details. There are a couple of questions in the chat. The first one is about the progress of battery technology and the increase in energy density. To what extent you think this progress in battery may influence the demand for charging points or mid long term?
Well, great question. Yes, technology is evolving. So we were quite confident that battery electric vehicles will be able to cover many use cases. But again, if you can't charge it, then you won't use it, you won't buy it. So it doesn't, if I understand the question correctly, it doesn't. I mean, the targets that we're faced with for 2030 already means that I'm not saying we will have to live with what we have now, but the products that are beginning to become available now are good and good enough to cover many use cases already. They will improve further, and that means they will become the powertrains, the batteries will become lighter. That means if the Commission's proposal for weights and dimensions, for example, are implemented, that additional payload will become available for these vehicles for future vehicles. But again, it's all nothing without the right charging infrastructure.
Perfect. I think it's the conclusion is that for 2030, it's we need to understand what can be implemented, even if we have a jump in technology. From that to get into the market, it's not straightforward. 1 year or two, you need a few years for industrialize those type of technologies. And the second one is also giving congratulating for your presentation, but also I think it's really going in a direction that we have discussed many times, Thomas, is on planning charging will be more critical compared to fuel. And what's your view on how to deal with this mismatch between the timeline for getting the infrastructure with the electrification or the vehicle technologies, I would say?
Yeah, if I understand you, thank you for the question. If I understand this correctly, then you're basically asking, yes, charging will of course be critical, and we believe that charging infrastructure that is being installed publicly for heavy-duty vehicles should always come with a booking system, a reservation system. So the one image that we really want to avoid is a queue at the charging station. Trucks queuing at the charging station. Some might see this as a testament for great development. We see it as a deterrence of those who actually need to run the vehicles. So the first indications that we have from manufacturers and also first customer use cases is this, of course, with the available range capacity of the vehicles today, you can cover many use cases already by relying on your own depot charging, provided you have sufficient power at your depot. But of course, as I said earlier, if we need to focus and cut the emissions on the heavy duty long haul, then this is where it matters. Then we need en route on the highway charging infrastructure available. And if I may, this brings me also to the next question here. Developments are ongoing with respect to the charging technology. So there's inductive charging being explored further. We don't have too much, sympathy is a very strong word, but we don't see overhead catenary charging options as a solution for cross-border European road transport. It may very well be a solution for confined areas, for areas where we don't have access to the grid, for example, and other things, but we don't see it as a solution for that replaces batteries, battery technologies. And that brings me to the last question here: battery swapping. The battery may very well be 40, perhaps 50%, depending on vehicles, of the vehicle value. So swapping the battery is not something that is being pursued currently as a commercial option, simply because, I mean, it would the battery electric vehicles are already immensely more expensive than conventional vehicles. Having to have two batteries of the most expensive part of the vehicle. This doesn't sound like a convincing business case. So there is no, just to reiterate this again, decarbonizing road transport cannot and will not happen successfully on the shoulders of the vehicle manufacturers alone. And that is different to what happened before for other challenges we faced before. So if we don't get the infrastructure, we have an issue, but we do have this collectively. we should not try to find solutions for problems, battery swapping as a potential solution for infrastructure shortages. We should try to solve the infrastructure problem.
Thank you, Thomas, for addressing those questions. Still, there is one additional, but I see a hand raised. But allow me, as there are other presentations, so that we'll do is to move on with the next presentation, and at the end we'll have a possibility to discuss the additional questions.